What you listening to, son?
I don't think you like it.
Well, why not? I like this new generation of music.
Back off, Buster.
There's nothing funny about these sounds. What that person on your tape has is a medical disorder.
This gig is created in two different phases. The first phase is the synthesizing phase. And the second phase is the audio layering phase, which I do in Patcher. But don't worry guys, it's gonna be simple and I'm gonna explain it super well. Here is the kick, and the first thing I wanna actually do is this. Let's listen to this kick by itself. Now we are going to take a listen to the synthesized kick. You can hear that they are pretty much not completely different. The punch is the same, but the tail is super crunchy in this audio version. And don't worry guys, I'm gonna show you how you can end up with the result I have over here. So, as you might guess already, this is made completely in Serum. I wanna start with the punch. So the punch includes two different things. First thing is the talk, which sounds like this. And the talk is just a snare drum, as you can clearly hear. No additional effects on the talk. We are going to talk about these bus channels just in a minute. Then we have the actual punch, which sounds like this. The main punch layer is here. And before we dive into the punch, let's see how the mixer routing is done. In the insert channel of the punch, we really don't have any effects. But as you can see, it's routed to a punch bus. And here we have a lot of effects. The punch bus includes the talk and the punch. After that, it goes to a kick bus, which is including the punch and the tail. As you can see in here, the tail is routed to the punch plus tail bus, and so is the punch itself. This is my great representation of the channel routing, which is super important for this particular sound. The tail is routed to the punch and tail bus channel or group channel. This is the talk, aka the snare. This is routed to the punch bus, like so. And now the punch is obviously routed to the punch bus as well. Now the punch bus is routed to the punch and tail channel. So in this channel we can process all of these sounds in a group together. And in this punch bus we can process the punch elements together. And in the tail channel we are obviously processing the tail. First of all, I'm gonna disable all of these effects on the punch bus, so we get the pure sound from Serum. Opening the punch preset in Serum looks like this, and without any effects on the mixer sounds like this. Still kind of a nice punchy sound. Now, as you can see, I am not using any real single cycle oscillators here. I'm just using the noise oscillator. I am using a company rhythm snare on the noise oscillator, and I am enabling the pitch tracking. Let's remove the filter and the couple of effects I have on the punch sound. You can clearly hear that it is just a snare with a pitch envelope like this. If you are wondering how to make a pitch envelope on the noise oscillator, you can just take the LFO, route it to the master tuning in unipolar mode. Remember to set it to envelope mode. Now activating the filter, the sound transforms to a noisy mess of frequencies. And that is because I'm using this high resonant peaking filter. Now taking that mess of high and mid frequencies and boosting them even more with equalizer, trying to get it really kind of crunched up. Now what I want to do is I want to compress the sound and kind of crunch all the frequencies together. As you probably can hear, the sound is getting more kind of snappy and low mid heavy, and that is what I'm looking for here. Now the last thing is of course the distortion. I'm using the asymmetrical distortion with the pre-filtering activated. So if you really think about it, all I'm doing here is I am creating these huge peaks with filters and stuff like that. In here, and in here before the distortion itself. Next up, I'm gonna move on to the effects. As I showed you already, this is just a soft clipper. And then we go to the punch bus where we have a few plugins. Now the first plugin is the disperser. And this is a FL Studio stock plugin. So if you own FL Studio, you own this plugin. You can find it from the patcher. And this is the exact same thing as the kilohertz disperser. So this plugin is completely based on all pass filtering. Now, if we are going to take a look at the automations here and play the sound when I activate the disperser, you can already hear the kind of dispersive sound that it creates. It's that kind of wet and really interesting bassy type of sound. And also, I am automating the XY pad, which is controlling the frequency of the effect and the bandwidth of the effect. I have two automation clips, one for the X value and one for the Y value. And these fancy letters just represent the direction and the position of this dot moving here. So X can represent horizontal and Y can represent vertical axis or whatever. The next thing you probably are going to get confused with if you never used the disperser in FL Studio is how to actually automate this thing. So for that, I'm gonna open up a new instance of disperser. And now if you wanna automate this thing over here, you just right click. And as you can see, it opens up two different menus. One for the X value and one for the Y value. You just simply activate both of these things. And now you can create two different automation clips like I did here. Next up, we have another FL Studio stock plugin called Noise Unit. And this is a simple one. This is just going to layer white noise on top of your input signal. We are actually going to use this same plugin again in the audio layering, and you are going to see the power of this thing. I'm using a really small amount of white noise here. Next up, a wave shaper. And you can see that this is also just a soft clipper. So this sort of shape in the wave shaper is representing soft clipping. Next up, some EQ. Here I'm just boosting the frequencies I want to be prominent. You can obviously hear the punch being much more prominent when the EQ is on. Next up, another FL Studio stock gem, the 4x distortion. Here you can choose multiple different distortion modes, and this is a multi-band distortion thing. If we take a listen, super subtle difference, but it's making the high end a bit brighter. Next up, my favorite compressor plugin at the moment. You can of course replace this with your favorite one. So if we take a look at these compression settings, we can see that the release is really short and attack is really long. So this is kind of adding snap to the sound. Also some saturation. And lastly, the G clip. This is a free plugin. This is just making sure that we are not digitally clipping the sound over 0 dB. And the tail alone sounds like this. Really simple. Okay, so it's also made in Serum. And on the tail insert channel, we have a lot more effects on here, like so. I'm gonna disable all of these effects and take a look at this wave candy over here. You can see that the output of the Serum is actually just a really kind of distorted sine wave. Achieving this sort of tail that I'm doing here, you don't need to copy my specific settings. You just need to have a sine wave with some subtle saturation. Now, this is all based on filtering. If I look at this wavetable here, and to my knowledge, this would actually sound super high-end, rich, and probably annoying. If I disable these effects and take a listen, you can hear the true character of the actual wavetable. And it is super rough to listen to. And if you look at the waveform, now it's almost a skewer wave, which is super distorted. But just by activating the filter, we turned it into a sine wave. And that is the end goal. So now that I had the distorted sine wave, what I was looking for, I added this phasing filter with a touch of movement. Because if we open up the phase window here and take a look, we are moving the phase of the sound. And when we do that before a huge amount of distortion, we are going to create some movement to the sound and probably change the sound quite a lot. And you guys are probably familiar with this concept. So if I open up a equalizer on the insert channel, now let's imagine that we have a shit load of distortion after the equalizer. If I create a high pass filter, which is super rough, and let's say I set it up to 25 Hz. Now with the distortion applied, this is going to change the sound a lot. But if there was no distortion, we probably could not even hear the difference. And this is again based on phase. If I go here and open up the phase rotation window, you can see really similar looking phase rotation here as it is here. Really similar looking, but that's different. So this is all based on the phase rotation. Of course, if we take a look at this filter, it is also creating some notches here and whatever, but yeah, that's that. And I'm also moving it just so slightly, and that is to move the phase around, like so. So the last thing I added was the phaser. It makes the sine wave touch more clean because the phaser is of course stationary. So that's the whole patch. There is nothing else to it. So now that we have the kind of distorted sine wave, now what I want to do is I want to actually make it distorted to be a tail sound for hardcore kick. What I usually like to do when I'm using this technique is I want to add first of all some mid frequencies or mid presence to the sound, and I achieve that by using the distortion. So let's just activate the distortion first. Now when I activate the EQ, you can hear the movement on the sound. Let's talk about these specific choices of settings. So first of all, I added the distortion. With 50% mix, we are parallel processing with the distortion. I'm using the hard clip mode. I'm also using the tone dial, which is, to my knowledge, just a high-pass filter on the distortion itself. And it is set around 100 Hz to make the mid frequencies really pop out. Because when you push low frequencies to distortion plugins, they usually get kind of mumbled, you know what I mean. Then I used the symmetry dial to make the distortion asymmetrical, and I used the clip filtering, which is, again, to my knowledge, just a low-pass filter to remove some of the really harsh high-end sounds, because I don't want to add those yet. Using the DC filtering to center the sound around the zero crossing point of the waveform. And let's take a listen with just the distortion. And with the EQ, yeah, I just fiddled around with the EQ to kind of shape the sound how it sounded good to me. So those are the first plugins. The next plugin is a interesting one. It's a super rough wave shaping distortion, and let's take a listen. Wave shaping is all based on the volume and manipulating the volume of the input signal. This horizontal line is representing the input signal and the vertical line is representing the output signal. And this white line is the transfer curve. When we manipulate the transfer curve, we kind of boost the input signal in specific parts of the waveform, and that is distortion. If we really think about it, this wave shaping distortion and most of the distortions are all based on volume manipulation. Automating the pre-dial with the wave shaper and with other distortion plugins usually makes a big difference to the sound. And if we take a look at this automation, it is super subtle, but it is adding that touch of movement to the sound, which will multiply again when we process this sound even further. Here I'm also activating the centering or the DC offset to make sure that the waveform stays centered around the zero crossing point. And I am using the asymmetrical mode, which just means that I am processing the negative and the positive polarity of the waveform separately. So you can imagine it like this. This point here is representing the zero crossing point on a waveform. This line on the wave candy is also representing the zero crossing point. Now we can process the signal on the positive side separately to the negative side, which you can actually see on the waveform. If you take a look at this shape and this shape, you can see how different they are. Next up, a actual phasing plugin. By looking at these settings, we can see that the sweep frequency is sitting at 0, which means that the phasing is actually stationary. I'm using 8 stages of phasing, so if I remember correctly, it's probably just 8 all-pass filter in serial. Because phasing is also based on all-pass filtering, just like the disperser is based on all-pass filtering. Yeah, then I just basically fiddled around with the feedback, dry wet, knobs until I got the sound that I wanted, which was this one. So it's kind of making the sound more thick and little bit more smooth to listen to. Next up, I have another wave shaper. And this is just a double curve selected, and it's making the sound super fat. Then the balance plugin is just automation for the tail beginning point, as you can see in here. And the last wave shaper is also just a soft clipper. So now we got this. Now we can go on to the punch plus tail bus. If you look at this EQ, it's pretty interesting looking. So what I usually do next is I take a track that I really like and feel like is really similar to the track I'm creating. I loop the kick of the track and I scan the profile of the kick with Pro Q3 by using the match EQ thing. This is not necessary at all, but I still like to do this sometimes. I'm not using this always, but sometimes I just try it, and when you use the EQ matching thing, it's going to create a super drastic EQ curve, and it of course did it for me as well. So I manually usually tame it down a touch, so it's not that insane. Then I just listen to the sound with and without this EQ curve, and if I feel that it's better with this EQ, I just leave it on. Because we are going to process this sound so much that you are not going to hear that rough EQ. It's probably just going to help us. And yeah, that is just a thing that you wanna try if it works. But if it doesn't work, don't do this. This is not necessary whatsoever. And finally, just some reverb to add some room to the sound. And now we have this kick, which sounds shit. If I open up the Edison over here, and let's listen to this. You can hear that this is the exact same kick as we have in here. So the next part of this video is going to be the phase 2, or the audio layering part of the video. We are going to do the layering from scratch, because I feel like the layering is the most important thing. As you saw, the kick doesn't need to be sounding like a kick at all in the synthesizing phase. The most important thing is to get the punch somewhat okay. Because the layering we are going to do is going to transform the sound to sound like this. So let's begin the layering process. So this is the kick we have now. The punch is great, but the tail, not so much. Let's open up Patcher as a generator. I'm gonna copy the MIDI of my other Patcher into this one, so we can listen to the result we are getting. The things you are going to need in order to make this work is Nimble Kick 100%, and the other plugins I might use as a third party, not so much, but the Nimble Kick is the kind of the secret recipe for this thing to work. The first thing you wanna do is you wanna save your kick into the channel rack, like so. Let's give it a name. Try kick, let's say. Now inside the patcher, I'm gonna open up Nimble Kick, like so. I'm gonna clone this thing 3 times. Let's unroute all of these from the output, and let's name this kick punch, and let's name this attack, and this is going to be the tail. Maybe I want to actually start with the tail, so let's route this tail Nimble Kick to FL Studio. Okay, then we are going to drag our kick into Nimble Kick. Now the first thing we really need to do is that we need to separate the punch from the tail, and inside the Nimble Kick it's super simple. You just take this. Now the next thing I might want to actually do is to stretch the tail a touch. Now that we have this thing done, we are going to open up the punch separately. And of course we want to take the punch, like so. Separate the tail, solo the punch. And now we want to route the attack or the punch also to the FL Studio output. Yeah, something like that will work just fine for now. So now that we have the punch and the tail, or the attack and the tail separated, let's again remove the attack from the master and route the tail in here. Next thing we want to do is we want to distort the tail. And for that, we are going to need a envelope controller, which is just going to control different type of automations inside Patcher. Then we are going to need, let's actually do it like this so it's much more simple to understand. I'm gonna open up a effect patcher inside Patcher and place it here. Now right click here and we are going to find noise unit here, like so. We have the noise unit open, and then we need some sort of a really nice high quality preamp distortion. And for this one, I'm gonna use the Decimode 2. And you will soon understand why I want to use the Decimode. So now we have a combination of the noise unit and the Decimode. So what we are doing here is, I'm just actually using a noise generator and preamp distortion from the Decimode to create this really kind of distorted tail sound. Kind of reminds me of Ableton's distortion plugin that kind of does the similar thing. I cannot remember the name of that plugin. Next up, we are going to use the envelope controller. So what I want to do here is I want to control this gain thing over here with the envelope controller. So let's move this knob a touch, go here, right click, inputs, parameters, last tweaked was the gain. Now I'm gonna close these plugins so it's not confusing to watch. As you can see, we have this red kind of ball appearing here. This is the gain input control. Now inside the envelope controller, I want to use the articulator number 1 to control this gain thing. So I want to right click, outputs, controllers, and open up one articulator, drag it here. Now this envelope is controlling this gain thing. And that is what we want. I'm going to activate the tempo and make a shape something like this. And this is just to add movement. So we are basically using volume to control the amount of distortion we have, because the harder we push the sound through this preamp, the more distortion we get. And when we automate that parameter, we get movement to the sound. And I'm gonna leave it here for now, because we can of course edit that later. Now, if I heard correctly, there is some stereo on the tail and I don't want that. So I'm gonna open up the Fruity stereo shaper like this. And without explaining it any further, we just need to set these dials to -6 dB to make the sound mono like this. So these settings in the stereo shaper does the exact same thing as this thing in the mixer. So now as you can hear, we combined the left and right channel to be mono. And that is what we want. So for the individual processing on the tail, this is all we really need. Next up, we are going to process the attack and the kick punch thing. Let's actually start with the attack. So what I want to do in here is probably barely anything, because I think it's going to work just fine. We actually need a equalizer. I'm gonna use Pro Q, but use the equalizer you want to use. And I wanna cut everything below, let's say 75 Hertz. And yeah, I know we are clipping, but don't worry about that, at the moment at least. And then we maybe want to add the reverse punch, kind of. So let's just use a reverb plugin for that. So I'm gonna route the punch through a reverb and back into FL Studio. Then I wanna right click this wet dial, activate, add a lots of decay, some low cutting. And if I close the patcher, you can see that I have the automation for the reverb already active in the playlist. So now what I just need to basically do is to right click this thing over here and link this to the automation clip on the playlist, which is probably this one. Yeah, as you can hear, now we have the reverse reverb thing. The automation for that is just something like this, depending if you're using triplets or not. Just use your ears to listen to that. The next thing is the kick punch, and for this we are going to need just some sort of a normal kick drum. I have a lots of kick drums in here. This is probably just fine. So now what we want to do is we want to route this kick through the same effects as the punch, because again, we don't want any low frequencies on the punch for this particular kick. I'm also gonna separate the tail on this punch kick just to kind of make it shorter, like this. That is probably going to work. So the next thing we want to do is kind of the group or bus processing of the sound. First of all, use OTT in here. I actually might want to equalize the tail just a touch. So I'm going to add a equalizer before we go into the bus processing. And let's also add a wave shaper here. Like this. Now let's edit out the settings a touch. So I'm first of all going to edit the OTT, and what I want to do here and why I'm using the OTT is to kind of make the sound more in your face. And now probably some guys are going to say that OTT is going to mess up the face of your sound, and that is correct because OTT uses band splitting, and all the plugins using band splitting are going to mess up the face of your sound if you're not using linear phase filtering. But we don't care about that because if it sounds good, it is good. Okay, Now I want to soft clip the signal with the wave shaper. I'm gonna do this and this. Okay, we are already getting somewhere. But some more things you might want to do is, if you happen to own the Saturn from FabFilter, is to take that and go here to the V1 presets folder and open up this preset over here. And lastly, we are going to need some clipping. So I'm gonna use G-Clip. It's a free plugin, but I just like to use this thing. Lower down the clipping threshold a touch. So now my point about the hip hop puncher preset, if you go here and fiddle around with the mix. You can fiddle around with the mix if you want to. What else? There are now kind of, kind of endless amount of options really to go from here, because now you have the basic template of the kick ready to go. If you have any favorite plugins you like to use, you can try those in this phase. For example, one of my favorites is the Devastator 2, but that is laggy with FL Studio, so I kind of hate that. I need to use it in this sort of windowed mode for even remotely be able to use this thing. So now from here, you can of course edit the tail in the nimble kick. So yeah, as you can see, you can edit out the tail separately to the punch. And now that you have this kind of chain going on, I really suggest to save it. And now in the YouTube comments, if you actually are complaining about that you don't have the decimal or you don't have whatever plugins, this video is not meant to be a tutorial where you can actually kind of clone everything I do. Of course you can if you want to, but I'm really actually trying to teach you guys to create these kicks. You can go from here, we can actually listen to this thing in context of some sort of a melody. Let's talk about how I did the whole kick, because the video is already so long that I really didn't want to show you guys the process of me nimbling around with the EQ to try to make the kick sound good, because that is going to be different for everyone. Now the kick sounds like this. So let's go over this thing, and I'm gonna show you the principles that I use to end up with something like this. We are first of all going to open up the patcher, because it is looking a touch different than you saw in the video. So let's see here. Mainly the only real differences are probably the volume levels of the individual sounds. By the way, this third nimble kick is not activated, so it's doing nothing. So let's see here. The things I added was trash 2. And I want to disable this effect and this effect on the mixer channel. And let's hear the sound. So as you can hear, this trash has a super minimal effect to the overall sound. But I achieved this type of hollowy kick sound just by editing the existing kick that I already had. And I didn't want to include that into the video because it took like 2 hours to actually kind of figure out all of these settings and just trying to listen and reference my kick to other ones that I really like. Yeah, this is kind of the kick I ended up with. So the next trick, or actually a couple of tricks I'm gonna show you guys, are super powerful. First of all, this plugin called Black Box Analog Design. I really find that this plugin actually adds so much loudness to my kicks and makes them more crunchy. So let's hear it. The tail is more clearly audible now, but this thing over here, this patcher, listen to this. Sometimes you need to think simple. If you don't understand patcher, what this basically means that I am running the original signal parallel to the processed signal. Completely 100% parallel. So I'm gonna disable the original signal and let's listen to the parallel signal only. It's a trash 2 with this sort of EQ to remove some of the mid frequencies to add that kind of really nasty sounding peak frequency. And some really rough distortion, as you can see in here. I'm not going to go too deep into this because this is just an overall concept. Everybody can do this. Like, just take a parametric equalizer and fast distortion and fiddle around with the EQ until you get the result, because if you are using decent quality distortion, you will get there. And this EQ here is just to lower down the overall volume, because it's obvious that it's gonna get loud when I run the dry signal 100% parallel to this processed one. This sort of effect is really kind of opinion based. What do you like? Do you like the more dry sound or the more hollow sound or whatever? Or do you like it at all? These are just things to try. And yeah, this Devastator using these settings, just basically kind of compressing it a touch, I think. And we can actually listen to the sound with and without the Devastator. Kind of just makes it lower in volume, I guess, actually. Some mix-based EQing. This is again something that you don't want to copy from me. You want to listen to your own kick and reference it to others and figure out the frequencies you don't really need and figure out the frequencies you really want to boost and kind of be in front of the kick or mix or whatever. The next tip is really superb. This sample over here, this really clicky sample, is just to add snap to the sound. As you can see, the MIDI pattern is following the patcher pattern. And what this sound actually is just a ride. I turn the cut or the out actually to 100%. So it is kind of squeezing the sound. And then I start to rotate this sample start thing until I have just a couple of samples visible here. You get that click sound. And find the spot you like and adjust the volume accordingly. And yeah, this just adds some nice snap to the kick. It's kind of like a psychoacoustic fuck up. The hardcore kick overall is really a psychoacoustic fuck up. It's stupid to think that this actually is a kick drum. It's crazy. I don't want to think about that. What you can take out from this video and what are the main points? Well, first of all, kick synthesizing process is really fun and creative process. You really don't need to get close to a finished kick with that process. You kind of need to have the punch somewhat nice. The nicer the punch in the synthesized kick, the better. As you can hear and see from my video, the overall synthesized kick was pretty bad actually. Actually super bad. No movement, no nothing. But when you have the process ready to go, you don't need to think about that. Because my process is that I want to create some sort of a distorted sine wave for the tail. And then I want a pretty interesting and original sounding punch. And when I have those two things, I know that I can move on to the layering process. Because in the layering process, as you saw in this video, we kind of created the tail from that distorted sine wave. And that was super easy trick. And then the punch, we just added the punch kick under the original serum punch, EQ'd the low frequencies out of it, created the reverse tail by using reverb automation, and then we combined the punch and the tail into a bus channel to glue those elements together. And by manipulating the settings on the bus channel, aka this chain over here, you really create the actual movement, or not, maybe not the movement, the actual characteristics of the kick. When you have that and you're happy with that, you can take more steps to do things like this if you want to try some, or add some more distortion or compression plugins. I like to do the kind of the sound design portion inside Patcher, so I think this as a sound design still, because it is. And what I do on the insert channel is more mixing related usually, but I guess you could say this is sound design, but whatever. Create a process that fits you, stick into that process, and don't give up. Someday we all can make nice sounding kicks.
Back off, Buster.